Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on critical minerals and national security. We're very pleased to have you here. And as always, we will be opening up for questions at the end of the conversation toward the last 15 to 20 minutes of the hour. So we welcome your questions at that point. We have a very distinguished panel joining us to discuss this today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Earthshot Foundation, our partner and co-host in this event, as well as all of our energy policy partners that support our series. This is actually part of a year-long program that we've embarked on with Earthshot Foundation to really dive deeply into this essential issue of critical minerals and how it applies to all of the goals that we share in the energy space. And that year-long program will include workshops, webinars like the one today, as well as a large session at the end of the year, which will bring it all together. So we look forward to all of your participation and input on this essential issue. And once again, we thank the Earthshot Foundation for its support and for joining us in this really important initiative. Finally, I do want to remind you, if you do have questions, please submit them in writing. We will get to as many of the questions as we possibly can before the end of the hour. I'm going to introduce our moderator now, Jane Nakano, who will conduct the conversation. Jane is a senior fellow in the Energy, Security, and Climate Change program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She previously worked in the Office of International Affairs at the Department of Energy, one of really our nation's experts on this topic. She is going to lead the discussion with our three very distinguished panelists. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jane to introduce our other panelists and to get the conversation going. Jane, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you for having me. Thanks to the colleagues from Our Energy Policy. We are, there's so many challenges, but I think when it comes to both the energy transition, but then also national security, I think how the global supply chains for critical minerals look like today and how they might be evolving is one of the most important questions that we focus. And I'm joined by three excellent speakers today. And so let me introduce in the order of, I guess, alphabetical order, if I may. But I guess we still have one of the speakers probably joining a little late. But first, let me introduce Adam Scher. He is a lieutenant commander, and he's currently at the Seton University as a professor of military science and also the director of the Army ROTC program there. Also joining us is Cina Vazir. He is a managing consultant at the Mackenzie, where he focuses on the intersection of geopolitics and commodity markets. Little later, we will be joined by Chris Davy, who's the Director for Energy Transformation in the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State. I think, to begin with, I wanted to sort of make sure that we are all sort of speaking from, the same understanding of what sort of challenges that we're facing as a nation, but then also one of the key, Western economies that are trying to, tackle some of the national security, decarbonization, but then also economic security issues. When we look at this set of questions, I think today's focus is very much on especially the nexus between critical minerals and national security. And when we look at the global supply chain, for these minerals, you can't really miss the fact that it's highly geographically concentrated. Often diversity is the key for many things, whether it's the general energy mix or electricity mix, but then also in the critical minerals markets and critical mineral supply chains, diversity would be a key enabler for resilient supply chains, but that currently lacks. Quite, I mean, in a straightforward manner, we noticed that China is the dominant nation along this supply chains, and it's not just the mining, but it's also processing. Many of the U.S. and its close allies, such as Australia, do have mineral resources and some extraction for these important critical minerals. For example, Australia accounts for about half of the global lithium extraction, but when it comes to global capacity for processing, China is the dominant power. China accounts for about 60% of, at least 60% of the global processing capacity. When it comes to something like rare earth, the dominance is even more defined, or it's quite actually overwhelming in my view. China has about 60% of the global extraction, but accounts for nearly 90% of the processing capacity. So, as we try to unpack the nexus between critical minerals and national security, we definitely have to understand that there are different segments around the supply chains, but then also the level of dependence the United States and our partners and allies have on this very geographically concentrated supply chains. First, let me actually, turn to Cina and sort of help us actually take a little deeper dive as to what are some of the minerals, critical minerals, where the supply chains are particularly vulnerable to disruptions. It could be from just a logistical glitch, like perhaps COVID-induced incident that we saw a couple of years ago, but could be also from the geopolitical tension. But what are some of the minerals that we should be really concerned about and focused on?
Sure. Well, thank you, Jane, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I think I'd start answering that question by kind of taking a step back and looking at methodology. And the USGS, United States Geological Survey, actually has a pretty robust methodology for looking at critical minerals and assessing their criticality. And that really cuts across three different areas. The first is basically, it's called disruption potential, but what it is the question of how concentrated is the industry and how much is the main supplier in that industry willing to supply and also able to supply. The second is trade exposure. So essentially, as the United States, how much of our consumption do we need from abroad? How much of it do we need to import? And then the third is economic vulnerability, which really looks at GDP and says, okay, the end use industries for a given mineral, how important are those to our overall GDP? And then specifically, how important are the minerals as a component of the cost of those end use goods? So how much are those minerals contributing to the cost, and how much are those end use products contributing to the US GDP? So that's kind of an economic vulnerability. And those three things are, what the USGS uses in our principal kind of critical minerals list to determine criticality. And the top four minerals kind of coming out of that, which I generally agree with, are cobalt, neodymium, gallium, and niobium, which all have kind of different challenges, but all share those kind of characteristics of being heavily concentrated, of us relying very much on imports, and of having a kind of outsized influence on the economy. In addition to that, I would add to that list potentially graphite. So one thing we don't always do with the USGS list is look at both mining and refining. That's kind of applied inconsistently. So in some areas we do look at both, and we take the one that's more concentrated, whereas in other areas, for some reason, we don't maybe do that as well. And with graphite, you see natural graphite being relatively concentrated, but the processing of that graphite to spherical graphite being very, very concentrated. So that's kind of one to add to the list. But I think there's another part of your question, Jane, that was very interesting, which is kind of looking at the geographic concentration of upstream, which is mining, and then comparing that to refining, which is located in certain areas, not because of geology, but rather because of kind of industrial policy and economics. And when we look at the upstream side, what we see is, and that's mining, what we see is really heavy concentration. So we've always thought of oil and natural gas as two things that are, extremely concentrated, and it's caused a lot of problems economically and for energy security. But those two, if you look at the three top producers of oil and the three top producers of natural gas, they equate to a little bit less than half the market. If you look at something like nickel, Indonesia is forecast in 2024 to go around 60% of the market. That's just one producer. With cobalt, the DRC typically hovers around 70%. So more concentrated in the upstream. But one of the things you see in the upstream is that these different minerals, certain countries may control certain minerals, but very few countries, really no countries, have control over a multitude of minerals for mining, right? And mining, because that depends on geology, so it's kind of, pretty dispersed if you look across different commodity markets. The story in refining is very different, right? Where if you look at refining market share, China, basically 50 to 90%, sometimes even almost 100% of refining across many different minerals. So you have one country that across many different minerals wields a lot of influence. And I think the risks that you see for mining disruption versus refining disruption are also quite different. So for mining, some of the risks you see to disruption are really more around kind of the potential for some kind of emergency event. It could be an extreme weather event, it could be health events, it could be political instability. But then B, countries increasingly may be turning toward resource nationalism, like we saw with oil, during nationalization, you saw cartelization, and that threat supply. So that's kind of what the main threat is in the upstream. But then for the midstream, it's much more about US-China tension and how that could potentially lead to kind of export controls. So you would probably be inclined to worry a little bit more based on that about the midstream, kind of that US-China tension. But then you want to look at elasticity as well, where midstream supply, you can build a refinery in 1 to 3 years, whereas for upstream supply, it can take, depending on your estimate, 12 to 16 years to move from exploration to feasibility studies to financing to construction to first production. So elasticity is quite different as well. But overall, I would kind of agree with what USGS puts forward in terms of the list, but kind of add those additional considerations and nuance that are worth considering.
Thank you, Cina. And I'm actually also grateful that you mentioned some of the factors that go into the USGS, determination of what are critical, because it's the list currently has about 50, but these are constantly updated at least every 3 years. And it's also probably important to note that other countries have other ways of determining. It depends again about their economic setup and what they need, what sort of strengths or export or industrial capacities they have. So there's no sort of a unified, definition of critical minerals, if you will, and that makes it even somewhat challenging, but also interesting area to study from, more of a academic perspective. Let me now turn to Adam, and the critical minerals are certainly important for many of these sort of energy transition efforts, but certainly the U.S. military requires these minerals. And I wanted to help us better appreciate how and what are the type of reliance, and what are type of the certain, I guess, critical minerals that the U.S. military requires that are particularly of importance from supply chain perspective.
Well, thank you so much for the question, Jane, and thank you to the team at Our Energy Policy and Earthshot for including me, and to all of you out there for being part of this conversation. As a lieutenant colonel in the Army and a professor of military science, this is a unique opportunity in my career to get to study it and join communities like this that are part of the conversation. And I'm grateful to all of you that think about these policies, because again, as I'm here having this discussion, I don't represent the United States Army or the Department of Defense, so none of this is official policy. But I do come at this because critical minerals, and as Cina mentioned, gasoline and other types of fossil fuels that have been so important to how the military projects its power. From a tactical perspective, I've spent 5 deployments where more of our troops are hurt moving these types of logistics around the battlefield than in direct conflict with the enemy. And so just as I think Cina did a great job of giving that methodology, the Department of Defense list for the national stockpile of critical minerals is a little bit different. We include things like copper, graphite for sure is in there, and zinc, as well as cobalt and lithium and gallium. And it might be important to remember that the DoD has been stockpiling national critical supplies and minerals since the late 1930s. And the perspective or the methodology by which the DoD does it through war games is figuring out in conflict which are the material that will either limit our ability to produce defense weapons and equipment, or subject ourselves to that same sort of economic risk that makes it hard for our defense industrial base to perform and for us to fight and win. So there are perhaps some differences. But as we note, currently there are over 31 of those critical minerals that the Department of Defense imports, over 50% the United States does. And 14 of those we have no domestic production. From a Department of Defense perspective, we're looking at the critical minerals that go into batteries, communications, radios and satellites, semiconductors, the microchips that go into our most advanced fighter jets and our most technically capable computer systems, to include intercontinental ballistic missiles, all rely on these critical component parts. And in some ways, just as Cina mentioned, sort of the economic vulnerability comes with the cost of them to get to the end use good. That end use good, why I think it should matter to us and why the national security component of this is so important, are the tools that keep America safe and the tools that our frontline troops need when they deploy around the world in the battlefield, or when they deploy around the world to respond to natural disasters. So as we think of the Department of Defense as an expeditionary arm of U.S. foreign policy, in order for the United States to act as the global power that we are, we have to have a reliable source of these materials, and we have to have confidence that the materials that we put in have not been tampered with or have any other lack of assurance that the equipment that we use will work the way that we've designed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm also glad that you mentioned things like semiconductor and some of the energy storage battery, minerals, because I think, in up until a couple of years ago, when we thought of the nexus between critical minerals and sort of defense requirements, I think the focus is much more on the precision, war, the missile, guidance system, and etc. But in recent years there has been lot more both concern, but like investments into semiconductor capacity. And it certainly gives us a picture where these planning and both requirements, but then planning are quite dynamic. You really have to keep up with it, and what you do with stockpiling and etc. certainly becomes even more I guess attuned to probably some commodity cycles, but then also these technology advancement as well. So it's a fascinating front. Let me now turn to Chris. Chris Davy is with State Department, and now I wanted to ask you, Chris, about a little bit more about China, perhaps. So we've been talking about the nexus between critical minerals and national security, but overall, what are the type of vulnerabilities and national security concerns do you think that the China's dominance of the global supply chains create to the United States and to the West?
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate that. You can hear me, correct? Great, wonderful. So again, just wanted to thank my colleagues and also our Energy Policy and Earthshot for this excellent opportunity to talk about what I think has been one of the most important issues from an energy perspective of our current time is critical minerals. A lot of folks get in their cars and their electric vehicles and kind of forget the fact that it takes mines and minerals to develop that battery that allows them to go fossil-free around the country. And as our economies look to basically become electrified, what we're looking at is those electrons are supported by minerals in some way or fashion, whether it's in solar panels, whether it's in your wind turbines, whether it's in your EVs, whether it's in your chips, and of course, our defense industry is very much reliant on these critical minerals. So the basic question is, if our foundation for our defense industry, energy industry, electronics industry, several industries, and the future of our economy is based on critical minerals, it is of course of complete of national and economic utmost national and security concern that we can secure those energy supply chains or what we call critical mineral supply chains. So the vulnerabilities are the fact that our competitor, China has an amazing dominant role in this critical mineral, not only from a extraction standpoint internally within its own borders, but also through many of its companies outside of its borders, and how they, particularly on the African continent, but also in the Western Hemisphere, pretty much globally. And not only that, we look at it in the extraction standpoint, we're also, one of the really critical features in this is that the processing. And so I believe this was probably already discussed, but the processing is a huge concern, in part because we are several years behind in playing catch up when it comes to IP, or intellectual property, for these manufacturing. And a lot of folks think about, when you look at the critical minerals, they want to, the biggest difference I would say from the oil and gas industry and the critical minerals is that it takes a long time to develop these critical mineral, so anywhere between 5 to 10 years at least, and in hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's just for one mine. And so the question we have going forward in terms of that is that the vulnerabilities exist. We understand those vulnerabilities. We are looking at ways and working, and I just literally apologize for coming in late because I was literally coming from an interagency meeting on this, and I'm going back to another interagency meeting on critical minerals just to show, and really I have to say I've been in the State Department for over 20 years, and rarely have I seen one issue dominate the interagency as critical minerals has, which is a great sign. It shows that we're all on the same page, shows that we're all rowing in the right direction. We all know that we have a challenge ahead of us, but the good news is that we as an interagency are working together to try to create solutions. And to do that, we work with the private sector, we work with the Hill, we work with all constituents on this, and civil society organizations, because at the end of the day, I know we'll get into this a little bit later in terms of some of the efforts that we're trying to do. But at the end of the day, what we're trying as a holistic is develop domestically our resources in the continental United States, in Alaska, et cetera. And what we're trying to do is, in addition to that, because just in the United States alone can't, even if we mined every mine in the United States, that will not meet the demand, not only for the US demand, but the global demand. And so that is why we are looking at our international partners and expanding this basically to promote as much critical minerals onto the market with projects that have high environment, social, and governance standards, and then also provide local beneficiation. So we're doing this, and it is a race to secure these supply chains, because we've seen what the Chinese has done in the export controls when it came to gallium and germanium last summer, and then graphite last fall, and then the rare earth technologies in December. If that dial went from an export control to an export ban, it would have a significant impact on the market, not only for our defense industries, but also for our economic industries as well. I think these were highlighted, but just to end with, from right now, PRC extracts 64% of graphite globally and processes virtually all the graphite, both natural and silicon graphite. And then PRC extracts 60% and processes 87% of rare earths. And so rare earths obviously are not only used for the wind turbines for the magnets, but also for a lot of the defense industry. Germanium, for example, is very much controlled by China. And so these are the areas where we're trying to diversify. And the point being is, and I'll end with this, is that the issue here is we're not trying to make it technically a binary issue. It is just a common sense diversity. So the analogy that we like to give is just like any stock portfolio that anybody has, nobody has it all in one stock. You don't put your entire retirement savings into one stock and then hope for the best. You diversify those assets. It's the same thing in the critical minerals. It's the same thing with our partner countries around the world. They too want to diversify. They just do not want to be and have one client and one investor in their country. They want to have multiple investors, and they really do seek Western investment. So this is an opportunity for us, but it is a vulnerability that we need to take hold.
Thank you so much, Chris. And that was actually that was a great segue to sort of the next sort of set of issues I wanted to get everyone's thoughts. And by the way, before we get started, though, I do really commend all the federal government colleagues' efforts both obviously the executive branch, but also the legislative branch, the White House and Congress. I mean, when I started looking at the rare earth and sort of geopolitics, that was back in 2010 when, you know, China imposed unofficial embargo, and you know, the U.S. government started looking into some of the R&D to come up with you know, processing or manufacturing processes that would require, you know, less rare earth and other minerals and etc. But the you know, the level of focus and energy and commitment that I see today is just, you know, phenomenal. Obviously, you know, it's still a journey. It's sort of not a short journey, but I'm just really impressed with all the efforts that are brought to solving this challenge. And, you know, from the White House, you know, there are all these tools that we're starting to see. You know, the Defense Production Act being one, you know, the Title III Authority, but also, you know, Development Finance Corporation has been, you know, looking at, you know, how to also help some of the resource-rich partner countries, you know, access these mineral wealth, but also, you know, international multilateral efforts like the Mineral Security Partnership, which, you know, I'd love to, you know, hear more from you, Chris, a little later. But, and then also from the, you know, I also want to note that, you know, all these legislative support is there as well, right? I mean, the bipartisan infrastructure law had about a little less than $8 billion for clean energy technology supply chains. And that included money to support the processing, manufacturing, recycling of these battery materials. Also, the Inflation Reductions Act, you know, provisions like the Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit that, you know, aims to stimulate production of battery components, but then also critical minerals, along with, you know, clean energy technologies like solar, wind components as well. So we see really the, you know, largely bipartisan, and also both, you know, the executive branch and legislative branch really coming together in, you know, trying to address this big challenge. Now, I guess, you know, let me go straight back to Chris, actually, if I may. So I'd love to hear a little more about the Mineral Security Partnership, which now has over a dozen partner countries. And I think it's quite active in looking at ways to, you know, as you mentioned, you know, stronger partnership with other countries, but also private sector. So I'd love to get a little more details on where that effort is at and what we may expect out of the initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would highlight so the Mineral Security Partnership we launched this in June of 2022 as a means to look at how do we help secure our supply chains, because of the fact that it was obviously as we were rolling out these major pieces of legislation, we wanted to make sure that we could take advantage of these pieces of legislation and ensure that we had access to those critical minerals, of which much of this legislation is dependent on in terms of promoting both on the CHIPS Act, the Chips and Science Act, and IRA, as you mentioned, even the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I would say that the Mineral Security Partnership was a very much like-minded partners agreeing to move together on this effort to diversify the supply chain. But in part, we also looked at what was one of the key differences in terms of what our focus is and what our competitor was looking at. And one of the most important ones I would say is that we are looking at projects that have and push for the private sector to have high ESG standards in terms of environment, social, and governance standards, and also that provide local beneficiation. I think many of us here who've been attuned to the critical mineral industry have seen reports in several countries globally where the environment has been devastated, or there's been child labor, or there's been indentured labor, if you will, or tailing mishaps, et cetera. And so some of these countries just are left with this, and they sometimes don't have an alternative. And so our view is we would love to see as much production as possible in the United States, but in addition to that, we need to actually diversify supply chains outward. And it does three things, I would say, which really goes to the point. One, obviously diversifies our supply chains and strengthens those, so we're not dependent on just one. Two, it reduces the influence. And so when you're looking at it, so countries can actually have investment from different countries, and that allows opportunities for other projects throughout those countries in terms of diversifying those, whether it's infrastructure, as we have the PGI, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and how we work together with PGI, with the G7 initiative, and how, for example, the Lobito corridor in Africa, and how that's going to be connecting these critical mines that are in the DRC and Zambia and Angola, and bringing it to a port that's westward facing. And so these are opportunities of working together. So the Mineral Security Partnership, which now has 14 governments plus the EU, and you know, we have a little, our bumper sticker is this partnership basically involves over, you know, basically countries of economies of over 55% of global GDP. And so that is a huge demand signal in terms of critical mineral development from all those countries that are our partners. And so we've initiated that. We have over 23 projects. There's 9 critical minerals that we focused on, primarily focused on the clean energy transition, EVs, but we did add gallium and germanium because of the export controls that were put on those. And these projects are located throughout the world. So, you know, from Canada down to Argentina, to Greenland, down to Africa, all the way out to New Caledonia. So it's very global, it's very broad in terms of these projects, et cetera. There are different phases. They're at a processing or an extraction or recycling. We're very much proponents of recycling. And a lot of the projects that we have are focused on recycling because at the end of the day, that can contribute 10 to 50% of the critical mineral market just in recycling. And so that we're very much focused on that as well. Not only is it, so it's good for the environment, good for the economy. And so I would say that going forward, what we just launched is the MSP Forum. And so that was launched 2 weeks ago by Secretary Blinken and the EU's Vice President Dombrovskis. What this partnership is, it's within the MSP partnership. And what we look to do is formalize our engagements with mineral resource-rich countries and to focus on two key areas. One is obviously projects. We want to promote projects and have Western investment in those projects. And again, as I said, with high ESG standards and local beneficiation. But another aspect of this MSP forum and working with these mineral resource-rich countries that are, again, global from the Western Hemisphere to Africa to Central Asia to the Indo-Pacific. What we're looking at doing also is messaging on and really working with those countries on policies. And how do we promote good policies that are good for investment climate, international arbitration, good for the environment, good for labor, good for human rights. These are what our companies want. These are what our financial institutions demand. And these are what our partner countries actually want on the ground. They want their local communities to benefit from these projects and not basically be extracted, pulled, and then the upside goes to the competitor's GDP and not the actual country that actually where the mine is. So this is a huge effort, a multilateral effort. It's at various stages in terms of these projects. We're happy to announce we had several joint statements over the last year in terms of 6 projects moving forward. In mining timeline, that's fast. We'd like to have all of them, but again, this is a lot of capital that's needed. But I think that this is a great effort in showing how our partners all are in agreement in terms of we all need to work together to diversify our supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I think that I guess the Western model of engagement is not really driven or supported by the state control money, with like as in the case of China. And I think the value propositions are quite different, right? And I do certainly appreciate, especially building up upon Cina's earlier comment about potential rise of resource nationalism. I think addressing some of the local conditions proactively, I think that's a very important aspect of the Western engagement with these resource-rich countries. And I very much appreciate how these multilateral engagements are pursued.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me turn to Adam. I wanted to hear a little more about what the Department of Defense is doing, or what role does the Defense Department play in securing the critical mineral supply chains, and perhaps, as you sort of mentioned earlier too, but the defense stockpile, it's definitely a tool that the DoD has, and some of the sort of more current considerations as when it comes to operating the stockpile and how to secure the supply chains.
Thank you so much. And it really is an important question to highlight that the Department of Defense has two maybe roles here. There are many more, but as you asked the question, one, the Department of Defense has to secure all of the critical minerals for itself, for what it needs to function. But the Department of Defense very much plays an active role in securing the supply chains and ensuring that we have access to critical minerals for the entire national economy. And as we recognize that DoD's Defense Logistics Agency manages the strategic national stockpile for critical minerals, that really is just specific to what DoD would use for itself. Now, there are congressional ways that you could expand the authorities to say there are civilian economy critical minerals that we're going to ask the Department of Defense to stockpile as well. But those are policies up for debate that have good pros and cons on both sides, and we'll let our elected officials decide that. But it is important to note for right now that the only authority that Department of Defense has in its national stockpile through the Defense Logistics Agency is to maintain all the minerals that we determine from our list are necessary for us to function through our wartime combat operations and other types of requirements. From a broader perspective, I like to think about what role the DoD can play in this critical mineral space kind of in three big buckets: spending, operations, and relationships. And starting with spending, as you mentioned, our model is definitely not one where it's state-controlled government business, and a lot of this is private partnerships, private-public partnerships, and the role that our capitalist economy has. But the DoD is a big purchaser. And for the government, when DoD makes decisions for what types of research and development to invest in, what type of long-term contracts, we do send a demand signal for the type of either clean energies or other end-use products that are there. And so having consistent budgets that allow DoD to make those determinations for our free market partners to understand that there will continue to be customers in the Department of Defense and the military, and also things like the Office of Strategic Capital that is brand new to the Department of Defense that offers more flexibility in purchasing end items and allowing things to fail fast and still grow, in helping some of our companies overcome these valleys of death where it becomes hard to advance these new technologies. So I think within that spending area, and maybe this is the most important thing, is having predictable budget cycles for the Department of Defense gives DoD the most leverage to help communicate to private industry, the defense industrial base, our partners in business and industry, that there will be stable demand signals for their new technologies. Second, I mentioned operations, and I'll deny it. I know it's being recorded. The Navy is as an Army officer, it is the Navy that does the most for us to have access to supply chains, minerals, freedom of the seas, access to the global commons. What the United States Department of Defense does, and the American taxpayer pays a premium for the United States to protect the global commons. And the price that we would pay for some of our end goods goes up. You just look at what the Houthis are doing in the Red Sea, the risks that we have to the Straits of Hormuz. All of these critical choke points and nodes that transport either the minerals from downstream to upstream or the end use products, the cost of that shipping would go up if each of these businesses or countries didn't feel safe and secure while they were shipping and moving around. So the day-to-day operations, it's not the stuff you see on the news. It's not the Navy's day-to-day mission that allows the United States economy to plug in, and quite honestly, the rest of the world to feel secure in their transportation and shipping, helps maintain the United States access to critical minerals. And I'll end with relationships, and I think Chris described it extremely well. One specific, the MSP, is a new design relationship, but I look at our relationships across the board, especially in the countries, many of them in the global south or other areas where the mines for these minerals currently geographically exist. Jane, you opened it with this being very much a geographic problem. Well, our relationships through the DoD, through the State Department, when we do defense security cooperation, is about instilling values, good governance, and in the hopes that the mines are operated with our values and interests, that the environment is being considered. And if I can jump into, as you asked Chris a little bit about the question with China, as we think about the CCP's practices, both in mining, both in the way that it uses infrastructure development, the Belt and Road, in the way that it treats its people and its business, a world that is safe for how the CCP chooses to conduct its business is not a world that I think any of us should want to live in. And the Department of Defense has a role in helping the rest of the world recognize that China's money that comes with other strings attached, or their business practices in mining and producing these materials, is not the way that it has to be. And so forging our relationships and promoting our values through the connectivity that we have through the military being deployed and shoulder to shoulder on training and exercises, I think is a great way for the Department of Defense to help those countries see the role that they play both in their military apparatus and their civilian economy.
Thank you, Adam. Speaking of the global south, I think one of the there are several key challenges, but I guess one of the challenges is, where they get the capital, right? Capital investments. And so I guess let me then, turn to you, Cina. If you could sort of illuminate, some of the, like challenges within that, sort of capital investments that resource-rich global South countries face as they aspire to really, get the more economic value out of these, resource wealth, the critical minerals and metals, and but particularly critical minerals. And then, please, Chris, please feel to jump in if you want to follow Cina, that would be great. But, what role does the global South have? But then particularly what role the private capitals could be having and what should be done?
Sure. So I think, Chris was touching on some of this earlier as well. And the Global South does have a tremendous role, both in mining and hopefully in the refining as well, and maybe even farther downstream. And if you look at who's actually doing a lot of the mining right now, it is countries in the Global South. It is your Indonesias of the world and your DRCs of the world. But there's kind of two fundamental problems. One is, we see demand going up quite a lot, and we know that there needs to be continued investment for those countries to be able to scale capacity among other countries to meet that demand. And the second is the capital coming in needs to be diversified as well, right? Because you start to develop some very large problems when it's only capital provision is only coming from a certain country. You're seeing some of that changing a little bit. I mean, even majors like Rio Tinto, for example, they're starting to enter riskier jurisdictions. If you look at Rio's main projects right now, they're recent projects, a copper project in Mongolia, an iron ore project in Guinea, and lithium projects in Serbia and Argentina. The risk profile is increasing, I would say, for the majors as well. But there's a lot that needs to be done, I think, to make these to increase capital provision within mining in the Global South. And it's not necessarily an economic argument that the mines are not economic, they're very economic. What you need to see is more, for example, exploration. And this is something I think the US government is working on very well. A lot of these areas are still unmapped, or they may be mapped, but that information is really hard to access and very unreliable. So it doesn't create an investor-friendly climate. So you need to have more exploration, you need to have more kind of provision of information and access to that information. The cost of capital is the second one. So if you look at kind of domestic capital markets, in many cases, they're kind of very immature capital markets. If you look at the DRC, for example, I was doing work there and we were looking at lending interest rates in 2021, and DRC was around 23% lending interest rate compared to 3% in the US. So if you want to get capital domestically, it's going to be at a kind of crazy interest rate, meaning that you need to go abroad for capital. The problem with going abroad for capital is we see a lot of ESG concerns in kind of Western capital markets that makes them less willing to kind of provide capital to those markets in the Global South. And then I would say kind of the large concern is, mining projects and also refining projects are projects that have a large kind of lifetime, right? These are 20, 30-year projects with a lot of initial capital investment. So what you really want to know as an operator, as an investor, is that you have sanctity of contract. And that means there's large concerns about potential fiscal expropriation, so kind of tax bumps that you didn't plan for initially, renegotiation of contract terms, or nationalization. So kind of, just helping solve some of those concerns is very important to then seeing more capital being provided. And that's a place where, kind of governments can actually intervene, international governments, and help kind of talk to one another and do more. But I think currently those kind of those concerns that I outlined have led to an environment where you've seen a lot of investment coming in primarily from China. So if you look at like lithium or cobalt abroad, a lot of the Chinese companies have stepped into the gap, and they've been the ones willing to provide the capital. If you look back, like why is that concerning? I think if you look back to kind of emergency situations, let's take World War II, right, with oil and gas, you see, yes, in an emergency situation, the companies that actually own the assets do start to matter, right? They do affect trade flows, and a lot of their locked-in trade flows are going to be kind of preferential to their home market, right? So that's one part of it where, companies, particularly in emergency situations, do actually matter where those companies are from. But the second part of it is also, in a lot of these countries, we don't think of it that much in the US, but a lot of these countries, their economy is very much indexed to mining. So if a country comes in and provides a lot of capital and has a lot of influence over the mining sector, they also strengthen their economic ties with that country, and then by ways of that, strengthen their diplomatic ties. So this kind of ties in as well with the way that the US partners with countries economically and diplomatically, and the way that the PRC may be gaining that influence. Quickly flipping over to refining, it's a little bit different because you have some of those, like sanctity of contracts, some of those concerns I outlined earlier, but you also have more fundamental economic problems where there may not be economic competitiveness always right now for mineral refining. There could be in the future if you do certain things, right? You leverage more industrial policy, you integrate operations to get mines supplied to refineries in an integrated manner. But I think ultimately what you need to see, some of the drivers right now that are making it potentially not as competitive as it could be, one large one is energy infrastructure. So a lot of smelting, refining requires a lot of energy. You need to have reliable energy. You need to have cheap energy, and ideally you need to have green energy. So there's work to be done there. There's logistics as well, so it's importing things and also exporting things. Those costs can be exorbitantly high in a lot of these developing markets. And then, I think there's kind of also a skills gap in certain situations. So if you look at like lithium refining right now, it does require, it is pretty complex to do it the way the Chinese are doing it at those costs. So it requires a bit of know-how as well. These are problems that can be solved, but they kind of factor in economically to why you're not seeing so much investment going in. With that said, I think right now there's a window where, as Chris was saying, the rest, many advanced economies, kind of Japan, South Korea, India, countries in the Gulf, the US, et cetera, all want to see more diversified midstream. And they realize that in their own countries, sometimes it can be difficult to actually bring that in. So they're willing to do more investment, I think, within those developing countries. And the countries in the global south themselves want more value addition. They don't want to be shipping that value abroad. They want to have it locally. So there's kind of a win-win situation and aligned incentives and a window there. And the question is, how do you use blended finance to kind of de-risk those investments? How do you bring in a consortium of players rather than just one player, such that you can also carry risk between multiple companies rather than just one? And kind of the point I would conclude with is that the current environment we're seeing from a market's perspective is a little bit difficult right now for capital provision, both because, if you're looking at lower price environment, when you plug that into your NPV model, you see that the low price is hit when your discount rate is kind of the lowest. And then over time, because of the time value of money, when prices go high, less of that is kind of coming through back to your NPV. So even though prices are cyclical, being in a low price environment does make it difficult to raise finance. And the second thing is high interest rates, right? Because those chip away at your payback periods. So those are kind of, from a market perspective, some of the concerns we're seeing and difficulties for financing these projects.
That was fantastic. Thanks for the very rich market perspective. Chris, would you like to add anything?
Yes, two things. And Cina, I absolutely, totally agree with you, hitting the nail on the head on all these issues. And these are a lot of risks that we have to review and understand and then try to mitigate. And so to do that, and to what Cina noted, is part of the way we, and to answer your first question, Jane, absolutely, the Global South plays a major role in this. And they will continue to play a major role, and we want them to play a major role. They need to be the goal. We look at the Global South as part of the solution. And so, and we want to treat all our partners as equals as we move forward on this and try to determine how do we get the best projects there, but also make sure they're upscaled, if you will, so midstream and then further downstream, that they also get that bump in GDP and benefits and economic benefits of that too. Into the 2 points I wanted to highlight really quickly is one is on the crowding in. Financing, absolutely. No one really wants to take on a seriously risky investment climate. But if you crowd in finance, you crowd in public finance along with private finance, you bring in the international multilateral development banks as well, or in or MEGA, for example, for political risk insurance or whatnot, that will help bring in and help with those Western investments going into these countries that are a little bit on high risk. But again, sharing that, and part of the MSP is going to be looking at that. How do we bring in our export credit agencies or development finance institutions? And some of our partners actually have critical mineral equity funds. So how do we bring these in and look at this jointly as a means to crowd in finance, but also de-risk, so no one's basically holding the bag, the only bag. We're all holding the bag. We're all trying to make sure it works. And so that's one area. And then two, in terms of on the local beneficiation of the supply chains, absolutely that has to be a key component when we look at these investments. And a lot of these countries in the global south have the minerals that we need, but they also have the minerals that they need as well. And how do we work together jointly so we can promote our economic development and growth jointly? And so that as the famous line goes, rising tide lifts all boats, and that's how we see this in terms of what we're trying to do on the projects. Thank you.
That was perfect. Now let me turn to the colleagues from our energy policy for, I think there are a number of great questions coming in. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll jump right in. Thanks, Jane and team. This has been a really stimulating discussion here. We'll jump off with the first question here. Thinking geopolitically, it seems that the Middle East, broadly speaking, is growing and focusing on minerals. How should the U.S. approach this from a national security perspective?
So I can jump in on this one. So I was actually in Riyadh for the Futures Mineral Forum in January, I believe. And what we look at in terms of, because there's critical mineral development, not only from an extraction standpoint, but also on the processing side, midstream, if you will. We have it, there's, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, et cetera. And so the way we look at it from a national security angle is that we're all looking to make sure that markets are diversified. And so if these countries, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere, are looking to diversify the supply chain and create that diversity for the market, I think that diversity, as long as they're doing it with high ESG standards, I think promotes that benefit that we're all seeking, which is how do we diversify, and so it doesn't stick to just one entity that is dominating that market so much. So if you have it, flat, if you have it, you get like 20% here, 50% or 30% here, 10% here, 5% here. That's great. You're starting to diversify the supply chains, and you're strengthening or you're reducing the vulnerability globally. And so then when you look at it, then also you have to look at what markets are the Middle East going to be focused on. They're going to be focusing on their own market, obviously, but they're also going to be looking at the export markets as well. And so we look with our partners, et cetera, on this. But I think that anything that can bring diversity to the picture, that's done in a manner that's helping countries improve their economies and improving with high standards in terms of environment, social governance, I think is a win.
Excellent. Appreciate your thoughts on that, Chris. Next up, are there any specific congressional actions that are needed to help ensure adequate critical mineral resources to meet our national security needs? For the panel.
I think I'll just reiterate that having predictable budget cycles is probably the biggest thing from a DoD perspective that would be congressional action that we see every year, and having that authority in this new Office of Strategic Capital gives us the continued flexibility in purchasing and the continued predictability in budgets.
I would add to that one thing, some discussions we're seeing from the congressional side as well in terms of recommendations Some of it, a lot of it is honestly around permitting, and that is for domestic supply, both in the upstream and the midstream, and also just kind of more broadly for the entire energy transition. So it's thinking through, recommendations around permitting and how we can accelerate that, but how we can do that in a way that also accounts for a lot of the very genuine risks and concerns. And some, recommendations that have been put out, for example, have been looking at, looking at communities that have already signaled that they're ready to go. And when they have other projects in those jurisdictions, then also potentially accelerating review of those projects, as well as potentially looking at kind of stricter adjudication timelines. And then the other thing that's come up right now quite a bit for critical minerals as well is this issue of price stabilization. And the idea of, is there a way, and maybe this is through purchasing, or maybe this is kind of through put options, that you can help stabilize on the downside and potentially even, impose some kind of a ceiling on the upside for certain commodities, right? So this is not something that you would want to see kind of across the board for every commodity, but rather for very, very niche commodities where you have very kind of large market failures. So if you look at something like rare earths, where we import, annually, the U.S. consumption of rare earths is around 600 million, and that unlocks around 400 or 500 billion of economic activity. So large asymmetries and huge price volatility and very little price discovery. So maybe kind of in the nascent days of the industry, you want to offer some price stabilization, and that would be something that would need to ideally come through Congress.
Excellent. Thanks for your thoughts on that. Next up, are there any MSP projects that will be located in the U.S.? And what are the explicit benefits for projects that are chosen to be a part of MSP?
Great question, and absolutely. We are working with our Department of Energy and Department of Defense colleagues to get some MSP projects onto our list. The reason why I highlight that is because we wanted to defer to our colleagues that have already done the due diligence and are looking at funding projects here in the United States. So we want to look at that and determine how we could be supportive of that effort by putting them on the MSP list. And so I'd say the three key value adds in terms of being on the MSP list, first and foremost, is having 14 partners and plus the EU, 14 partner governments plus the EU trying to determine and work with these projects to get them off the ground or moving forward, or resolve issues of whatever issues that they may have. Second is access to public finance and working with our partners equivalent to the ECAs and DIFIs, and how we can bring them together and try to promote public financing for some of these projects. And third is also working at the multilateral level, where we look at the multilateral development banks as well and try to bring them into the equation where there's necessity. But I would just put a point that in all our conversations, we're talking to the private sector, and we let the private sector take that decision, and then we respond to that. We don't take a decision for the private sector.
I hate to jump in here because I'm sure there's a lot more questions, but we're near the end of the hour, and we always want to respect the time of both our distinguished panel and our audience. I can't thank all of you enough. I mean, Adam, Cina, Chris, and Jane, for that stimulating discussion. I mean, I think everybody would love to hear it go on for a lengthy period of time. And I would encourage those of you in the audience to check out the resource library on the Our Energy Policy site, which has extensive materials that supplement all of the conversation we just heard. And also call your attention to the fact that this series that is being coordinated by Our Energy Policy and the Earthshot Foundation will be continuing through the summer and fall. Please be on the lookout for our next webinar, which will be a very deep dive into the supply chain component of it. But this discussion about national security, obviously so much at the heart of what we need to be mindful of as we deal with this issue. I thought, Adam, your point about how the Department of Defense has a role not only in assuring the availability of critical minerals for our military needs, but also assuring the smooth transportation and operation so that all of our other needs in energy and elsewhere associated with critical minerals can be met, I thought was such an important observation. So again, thanks to all of you. Thanks to Earthshot Foundation. Please let us know your thoughts on this. And as a final point, I once again want to thank Chris Davy, Cina, Vazir, Adam Scher, and Jane Nakano for this outstanding discussion. I wish all of you a great rest of the day. Thanks to our partners and to Earthshot, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.